All right, welcome to a special recording of the Benzo Rehab Dungeon. I'm Michael Deebs, as always. Joining me today is Jacob. We met through the Instagram, and we will be discussing apostasy today, deconstruction of faith. Not sure exactly how we're going to structure this conversation, but I think what we'll first do is kind of go through our backgrounds and maybe detail our walk away, so to speak, and how the differences of our backgrounds played out and how we left and the impacts of leaving faith were for us maybe. Jacob goes by gender neutral pronouns, so I'll be doing my best to respect that. But if I screw something up, I apologize in advance because I'm terribly good at that kind of thing. Admittedly. Uh, Jacob, would you like to go first on kind of talking about your background and your? I can go first too. It's up to
Yeah.
you.
So are we just running through the religious aspect specifically, or like how broad demographic are we going?
You can go into anything you want. Honestly, I think
Sh-
it's kind of all encompassing.
Yeah.
This
Um,
subject.
sure. Yeah. So I mean, like I grew up Catholic, um, middle class, uh, dad observant, raised in the Roman Catholic Church. Mom converted when she married him. Um, and went to Catholic grade school. Then kind of just like, I mean, like very early on, like was just like, yeah, this just doesn't make like not even like this doesn't make sense, but like, yeah, I just don't feel it. And that's keeping in mind that you have daily religious instruction and then
Of course.
weekly mass at the very least, maybe two times or more, depending on how often you go with your family. Um, but yeah, and then I mean, like, also, for me, there's a certain degree then, or like more in like junior high, high school, there was a certain alienation of like, well, the Roman Catholic Church and religion says one thing about, sexuality at the time was the main concern. And then also just, like, um, even aside from like sort of dogmatic issues, just thinking about kind of the degree to which the church as an institution has been responsible for just any number of kind of
Crimes against
blemishes.
humanity.
Yeah, blemishes on humanity. I was going to go milder, but yeah, crimes against humanity. From justifying the North Atlantic slave trade to
Sure.
you know complicity with the Third Reich or whatever the fuck, like there's just any number of things which like
Yeah,
um
there's been a weird political neutrality that's been tried to like that is tried to be like maintained by the church, but then it gets
yeah,
associated with the Third Reich and the
right.
Crusades
Well,
and all these other very political sort of
yeah. And I mean, this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but
sure.
like part of the thing too is, like the Vatican as an institution and like these just the very real central and global institution of the Catholic Church is something
Hmm.
that like historically like plays into anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States, which also would have been sort of compounded with like a waspy disdain for um Spaniards, Italians, etc., like
Sure, right.
people who or Irish, people who by concurrent racial sort of uh, color test would be considered white, but back then would have been sort of like racialized others.
For sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, and then now, like, I just kind of like I tend to describe myself as kind of culturally Catholic in the same way that like it's more widely said that someone who is like a secular Jew is culturally
Sure. Sure. For
Jewish, like
sure.
which it granted is pretty different considering it's like the specificities of Judaism versus
Hmm.
Catholicism. But yeah, I mean, like I tend to go to bat theologically or dogmatically kind of for Catholic um, claims in the context of like debates like within Christian thought, I guess.
Hmm.
But I don't. It's like I don't have a dog in the fight. Like I don't.
For
You
sure.
know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's for me. It's purely just about kind of like arguments about divinity, like that a Catholic might make versus a Protestant. But that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe a good way for me to segue into kind of my background because I think I had a much different response, also involvement in the church. I grew up Protestant, a very evangelical church goer,
Mm,
um, non-denominational, but Baptist by every term, essentially. So they said, "Oh, we're a non-denominational church," but the practices were incredibly Baptist.
yeah.
So you've got a lot of speaking in tongues and
Right.
the
Laying on of hands.
laying on of hands, which
Yeah.
factors into my story. So I was very active in the church up until I was about like 15 or 16, where I kind of had like a falling out of faith moment. I grew up in a very religious family that had a lot of issues with like abuse and thing. So I'd always kind of relied on. I think partially I was relying on the church as like an escape from my home life.
Hmm.
Even though my parents were involved in the church as well, but I was always going on mission trips and extracurricular activities, that sort of thing. And I actually had a set of keys to the church because of how involved I was with like events set up and running different programs like that. So I think it was about 15 or 16. I started to question the validity of some of the things because I very very studious as far as the
Hmm.
Bible was concerned. I started to notice certain inconsistencies in uh, I guess between there's the obvious inconsistencies between the Old Testament and the New Testament, but
Sure.
factual inconsistencies like, hey, this text says so and so was born on such and such day, but later on the Bible says they were born on a different day or whatever. And so I started to
Hmm.
question like I still very much believed in the religion, but I started to question whether or not the Bible was like the inerrant word of God and
Right.
not just something that was written down, had a lot of really good values to it. Obviously had the inconsistencies between the Old Testament and the New Testament on what like you should do with gay people or
Right.
prostitutes.
Or disobedient daughters.
Right? Yeah. So like uh, that always kind of gets hand waved away like, well, Jesus changed all that, we're good now, we're covered by the blood of Christ. And I always knew that there was inconsistencies, but I started to really question what the background of those inconsistencies were, whether or not
Yeah.
the Bible was a text that was written based off of like current political expedience rather than
Yeah.
um
Or
like
even like,
go
well,
ahead.
there's just the historical matter too of the Old Testament, like so much of it just being sort of earlier Mesopotamian
Absolutely.
mythology
Yeah.
reworked. And that's not like I don't say that as like that's not a value judgment
No.
against it. It's just a historical fact. And like I guess part of my problem too, and this I think I've had this negative experience more, I think, with Protestants specific. When frankly, like most of my negative experiences aren't even with mainline Protestants. Like
Sure.
let's be very clear about that. It's
Yeah,
with evangelicals because evangelicals are a special blend
they
of
sure are.
uh stupidity. Frankly, like I just the yeah, in a really wide sense of the term, but they in
Yeah.
particular are so hostile to any sort of historical evaluation or
Yep.
hermeneutics of the Bible. And instead, it's, I mean, to your phrase, it's political expediency. I mean, especially the way that it's been, you know, in the States, just kind of the um, ideological outreach arm of the GOP, and the GOP is the a sort of institutional thing. Like it's a cart and a horse situation there. I think like
Hmm.
kind of which is driving and which is just being kind of yoked along. But I mean, it's definitely a matter of complicity and like
Absolutely.
pretty concerted efforts. And obviously the Catholic church isn't innocent there, considering it's kind of unholy union with uh, you know pro-lifers of all uh, um, sectarian stripes.
Yeah, and it's not like, historically the Catholic Church hasn't been involved in like every war in Europe for
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No. I mean, yeah. Plus, the Holy Roman Empire, like
Yeah,
they're and just like the birth of Roman Catholicism as kind of like just late imperial religion
for sure.
um, in Rome. And again, it is a question of sort of political expedience. Um, but yeah, anyway, I sort of like sidetracked
No,
the.
no, no, that's fine. So yeah, that's not a bad sidetrack because it kind of plays into what kind of happens. So you were talking about how evangelicals are a special kind of stupid. Well, my church was very evangelical, um, and I had always had disagreements with the foundation of like my church in general. Um,
Mhm.
so the mission trips I would go on, I would never go on the like door to door. Hey, we're gonna tell you to worship Jesus mission trip sort
Yeah.
of thing. I always went on the mission trips where we were building an orphanage in a
Yeah.
country that wasn't as well off as we were, stuff like that. I didn't believe in just handing a book to a bunch of poor people and like telling them, hey, you just need to believe in this and you'll be fine. There's obviously
Hmm.
I always had a very, I would say, like baby socialist mindset. Kind of
Hmm.
growing up, like, because if you really read,
Well, it's like it's growing the kingdom. I mean,
yeah, yeah, not just
pretty
that,
sort
but
of, right?
I just understood that Jesus essentially was kind of a communist in some ways,
Hmm. Sure.
and there's no legitimate reading that you can do of the New Testament without seeing that the guy that's telling you, don't sell your wares in the church, give
Yeah.
bread to your neighbor, take care of people who are sick and hungry, um, I, I would really challenge anybody who doesn't believe that Jesus didn't have some kind, if real or not real, but the mythological character of Jesus um, was a communist or a socialist somewhere in there. Maybe not believing in state-run communism, but certainly person to person sort of anarcho-communism, I guess. Um,
Which again, though, is like just kind of a historical thing, or an acts not an accident of history, because I mean, no accidents, but like in the sense that like as a political force, there was this kind of galvanizing of um, you know, colonized people
yeah,
in
of course.
Palestine, you
Yeah,
know, uh, sort of rejecting older institutional Jewish authority and Roman colonial authority. I mean, there's definitely a reading there where you can say, okay, yeah, like this is an early kind of historical moment where we can imagine emancipatory politics
hmm
without kind of I mean, part of the thing though is just like Christians tend to support, regardless of evangelical or Catholic, ultimately come down on the side of just sort of a rigid adherence to institutional authority. Um, it's just that for Catholics, it's the church, and then for evangelical, it tends to be the nuclear family and like the ethnos. I mean, I don't know. Like yeah, that's maybe jumping into the weeds, but
No, no, that's fine.
yeah.
Like I said, this is a conversation that's kind of all encompassing in a lot of ways. Um, so yeah, what I eventually did is, I kept digging into this thought that I had that the Bible wasn't inerrant, and then I started looking into things like, the Council of Nicaea,
Hmm.
where the the church, uh, I guess the papal authority, kind of was told to round up every Christian, document and decide what was canon and what was falsehood, and they literally burned anything that they thought was falsehood. So,
Right.
there's a bunch of like missing early Christian doctrine, and so I started wondering, whether or not a lot of what made it through that process was, because I knew the history as a Protestant. I already had like sort of negative view of the Catholic Church institution,
Hmm.
because it's just kind of bred into every Protestant. It's the whole name Protestant is the protest against the Catholic
Right.
Church, right? So I started wondering, whether or not knowing kind of the history of the Catholic Church and how all that went down, whether or not a lot of what made it through in the Bible wasn't, again, political expediency for the ruling powers at the time. I've always had a mistrust of authority in that way, and so I wrote this, because I'm this kind of person. I wrote this, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 page essay on it, and started like I published it online. I was running a blog at the time, like a Christian blog, and
Hmm.
I've always been a very terminally online person, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
published that, and I guess maybe I had forgotten that several members of my church followed that blog, and
Hmm.
so they got a hold of it. They started raising concerns with the church council, like, hey, that you have this blasphemer that's got keys to
Yeah.
the church and running all these programs and going on mission trips with us and stuff, and so there was a huge falling out, and like it was very devastating in my life because like my entire social circle was collapsing on me, and my parents were very upset about it, and I had shamed them, I had shamed the church, etc., etc. So what ended up happening is me, as like a 15, 16-year-old kid, I got sat down in front of the pastor. Like there was like almost like an announcement about it at church, and then like everybody laid on hands and stuff like that, and we're talking like this is like 120 people
Yeah.
laying on hands to like cast whatever devil out of me that had taken over my soul. And then after that I had to sit down with a pastor, and he this 50-year-old man who's been preaching for his entire life against a 16-year-old boy that's just kind of like figuring things out and isn't
Hmm.
quite sure what's up or down at this point, and like having a stern talking to about how I needed to change and how I needed to trust the word of God, etc., etc. So I kind of rescinded some of that, and then kept on trying to be involved in the church, but like obviously I burned a lot of bridges in that moment, I think.
Hmm.
So I was no longer welcome at some church functions, and I was no longer a deacon, is what I was, and a deacon is just like a steward of the church sort of thing.
Yeah.
So they took that away from me. They took away my keys of the church, of course, and not that I was gonna abuse the church in any way, but I was so involved in the church that I just needed keys to the church so that I had access to uh, all the event setup stuff and whatever. So they took all that away from me, and I was feeling very rejected, obviously, and it was a very traumatic moment for me. Looking back on it now, it's kind of funny, but at the time it was like a life ending event. Very
Hmm.
suicidal from it. So it wouldn't be until like a couple years later that as I started to I also ended up getting kicked out of my house for different reasons. So I was homeless
Mhm.
as a 16-year-old for a little bit, and kind of couch surfing amongst a bunch of friends and trying to figure out how to stand on my own. And Yeah, so when I was 20, and I'd managed to like secure a footing, and I was going to school and stuff like that. And then when I was 20, I joined the Marine Corps, and being that far away from everybody I used to know, I started to like kind of rediscuss the Christian faith in my head, and eventually realizing how much damage it had done to me mentally. I became a very militant atheist, I think.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was I
yeah.
was listening to Hitchens and Sam Harris and
Harris, yeah.
Dick
The usual
Dorkins. Yeah,
suspects.
the
Yeah.
usual people. And I'm not too ashamed to admit this, but I believe the whole four horsemen of the apocalypse stuff. Like
Hmm.
with those guys, and I had a fucking computer background with all of them looking cool and shit, and
Yeah.
but yeah, I became
Damn.
a very very militant atheist because
That's like
because of
such a
that.
special moment of like early aughts internet culture too, though. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like,
no, and
I
that's
mean,
that.
especially just like our atheism, like
Right.
I just am the like the I am euphoric copy pasta,
Yep,
like
yep. Yeah.
so you were on the ground floor there
Yeah, no, it
with
was it was
with
it
that
was
shit.
it was that special time,
Yeah.
and I was going through, this big momentous change in my life, and so the thankfully, like, I was able to resist a lot of the like right-wing hateful rhetoric that they were also spreading, um
Yeah, right.
and that sort of thing. um and I, by the time I had spent like a year and a half in the Marine Corps, I was already like, oh fuck, I don't think I agree with this anymore.
Hmm.
But I have a 5-year contract, so this is gonna be a fun, 3.5 years. Um,
Right, yeah.
so I was able to resist a lot of the right wing rhetoric because I saw how dangerous it was, and I was like, well, it's not cool to hate people based off of their religion. Yeah, I think religion's evil, but if you truly care about people, you're not gonna like um, call them evil, horrible, despicable
Right, yeah.
creatures because they
Well,
they
and
have a
especially if
faith.
you're already going through a crisis of faith and you kind of have a natural like predisposition to be sort of like contrarian, I guess, or not just immediately snowed by authority, then like yeah, it makes sense that you would have that kind of like oh shit moment with nationalist like jingoist bullshit,
Yeah,
but at
and
the
and the
same
the
time,
reason I had joined the Marine Corps was partially because I'd lost my job. I worked in the building industry, and it was
hmm
2008. So
hmm
that job obviously fucking like went away. And so I was kind of like bouncing around like grocery jobs that didn't really fulfill me in any way. And um, even though I was kind of falling out of my faith, I still believed a lot of the, because I'd grown up my whole life. My parents would watch Fox News, so I believed
sure.
everything that I had seen about we're over in Afghanistan and Iraq helping people.
Hmm.
Obviously, I disagree with that now, but I
Yeah.
joined out of still having that root in the Christian right wing conservatism. Um,
Hmm.
and so especially after like my first deployment, I deployed twice. Thankfully, non-combat roles, both of them. But my first deployment, when I kind of got the ground view of what was going on over there, um, I definitely I completely stopped believing in the war at all. And I was also questioning my faith a lot, and I was I had some pen pals, some friends from back in the states that I was talking to a lot, and kind of going over these questions that I was having about faith and whether or not I believe in it, or having arguments with some old Christian friends of mine, et cetera, et cetera. And so
Hmm.
by shoot, when did I get back? So I got back in 2011 for my first deployment, and like yeah, I just had such a completely altered view of the world after both of those things that I became extremely militantly atheist because I thought that Christianity was just the worst thing that had ever happened in the world, and and that any kind of religion or spirituality was inherently evil, and so I was a very cringy militant
Yeah.
atheist at that point. um,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
let's go.
I
Go
think
ahead.
I went through like a similar ish phase, I think. Um, but for me, it was very much not really tempered with or by like personal suffering, but more just like the blatant hypocrisy that
Sure.
anyone with a
Hmm.
basic sense of logic arrives at. But like, then like, I mean, the reason that like people like that, I guess, are full of shit though, is that like, at least with the big names, with the Dawkins, the Harrises, the Hitchens, etc., like they're not so much new atheists as they are like people hiding their Western cultural chauvinism behind secularism.
Absolutely.
And the same thing happens on the left. It's like it's interesting to me that kind of cosmopolitan secularism, there's right and left wing iterations. And I mean, to me, the left wing iteration is, on the right, it's people who are just Islamophobes claiming to be secularists, whereas
Yep.
on the left, it's people who go endlessly to bat to justify Salafist, violence or
Yeah.
Wahhabist
Yeah. Yeah. Of
violence
course. Yeah.
because it's because the rejoinder their rejoinder is always, well, not all Muslims. And it's like, yeah, but no one's claiming it is all Muslim. Well, I mean, some people are,
Some people
sure,
are.
but
Yeah.
like the point isn't, the point isn't to immediately excuse, it's to. And the thing, I mean, what's fucking crazy is too, is none of them are smart enough to recognize the fact that like, this ideology is like, aside from oil, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's chief export. So,
Hmm.
if anything, it's not even an anti-Islamist stance; it's an anti-Saudi stance.
Sure.
Like, and I don't think it should be ridiculous or problematic to, you know, to denounce the Bataclans or the Pulse nightclubs of the world, um, and
For sure.
acknowledge that there are sectarian specificities. Like, if we're going to rail against hypocritical GOP senators who on a Monday vote against LGBT protections, and then the next they're blowing some other dude in a Minneapolis airport, then or then I think everyone's up for kind of equal
No, for sure. For sure.
scrutiny.
Yeah. And when I say I used to be a militant atheist, it's not that I'm like any less atheist now. Um,
Yeah.
it's just I recognize the positions that people are coming from, and I do see that a lot on the left, where people are like doing backflips to, like, justify why Islam is not that bad versus other things. And
But then at the same time, there's such a quickness to sort of denigrate and denounce, white Christians from the flyover states.
yeah,
And
exactly.
I mean,
And
all I want is, I want equal amount of like materialist skepticism and scrutiny
absolutely.
applied
Yeah,
to everyone. And all
absolutely.
that means is, it doesn't mean we have to be tearing people apart. All it means is we have to recognize, that people are the product of their environments, and that proposition applies equally for everyone. It's not, you know, I think this political expediency thing might be kind of the lodestar of the episode, but like,
Yeah,
we
I agree.
can't just be materialists when we're looking at people who it's politically expedient to be materialist about.
Mhm.
You know, and like, I think something like that can be talked about, in with regards to pretty much any sort of initiative that is going after typically like marginalized people, really, where it's trying to galvanize marginalized support for like power and like power structures and institutions. I mean, yeah, I mean, here I'm kind of pivoting just like general
It's
DNC
yeah,
corporate Democrat shit, but like you know
it's
what I'm talking.
yeah,
You know, like
it's an
it's
all-encompassing talk.
yeah, but yeah, I don't know. So that's just my riff on the militant atheist phase, I think. But
Yeah, and touching on that a little bit, it's why I'm no longer quite as militant as I used to be about it is recognizing my own walk in this circumstance, and I did mission trips. I wasn't specifically doing it to spread the gospel, but in some way, I was an arm of that project, and um just understanding that if I can change in the way that I did, give people that chance to, and not be a raging dickhead about it, because
right,
it
sure,
wasn't it wasn't Dick Dorkins that convinced me I should be an atheist. It was my own experience with things that made me fall out of faith, and that's something I see on the left a lot, is holding people's pasts against them, as if they don't
hmm
understand that in the same breath that they're saying all these horrible power structures exist, they'll be saying like, oh well, you joined the military, so you're an evil baby killer kind of thing. um,
yeah, sure,
and
sure, sure,
not
yeah,
recognizing that I had been the subject of propaganda for my entire life
yeah.
leading up to the point where I joined, and it was all rooted
I mean, I
in
think
Christian conservatism. So it's like without external input, like how was I supposed to know that I was wrong, sort of thing.
yeah. Well, and I think it just speaks also to the you know the degree to which there are swaths of the dispossessed that it is perfectly acceptable to be horrible to.
Yeah, I
And
mean, like your
if
Joel
that
Osteens and
swath
stuff
in
like
this,
that, right?
well, like I'm no, what I'm saying is
Oh,
like like the vis-a-vis, like in terms of people like going after anyone who joins the armed forces, as a murderous baby killer, etc., whatever the fuck, you know. Uh, my point being that like assume a number of I would assume at least half of those people, probably more, are driven there by economic necessity, fresh out of high school, sign
yeah,
up,
and
ship out, whatever.
there's a
And it's so like,
fuck, I'm blanking on his name, but there's a politician in West Virginia, I believe, um,
mhm,
who is a former Marine, and he rails against what he calls like the poverty propaganda of the military all the time, because he's a former Marine, and he feels like
mhm,
the impoverished people of America like get specifically targeted by the military recruitment, and it's absolutely true, because people who aren't desperate normally won't put their lives on the line for something that you know like nobody
right,
wants to die on a battlefield, really, unless there's some other like mental anguish going on there. But yeah, it
right,
is it
yeah,
is it is primarily people who are poor, who have this religious background. The discussion that we could eventually probably have about the military indoctrination and the religious aspects of it, that conversation could be like another long one that we eventually go on. Um, Obviously, I would know more about that than you, but I think
mhm,
somebody hearing about it would have interesting insight. To like go, oh man, that's pretty fucking terrible how they do that. um, but
yeah,
yeah, there's definitely like a targeting of even with the church in general. I think targets poor people, um, and then
yeah,
asks them
sure.
to give
It's
their
like the
money.
lottery.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm, but like obviously, like there's kind of a dogmatic reason for that in terms of just like kind of palliative care in terms of earthly life,
Hmm.
and then, death and, rebirth in heaven, whatever, being kind of the actual treat,
Yeah.
which I think is like pretty fucking evil.
No, it
to kind
certainly
of
is because you're telling people
dangle that carrot way out in front of people.
yeah, you're telling people who are poor and desperate that hey, your reward is in heaven. Also, please give us 10% of whatever you make, and um, well,
Right.
God will make sure that you're taken care of because of that. And then yeah, there
Yeah,
are
and I
there
mean,
are
like,
certainly insidious aspects to how the church operates for sure.
and that, but it also doesn't. I guess it doesn't wind up meaning that those people would abstain from political decisions or political life, because what they do is they wind up in this, context of the states, backing the GOP because the GOP sells them the kind of culture war,
Yep.
um, grumpy pills that they
Yeah.
want,
No, I think.
while also,
Go ahead.
just disregarding the material issues, because it's I think on the one hand, what what like what black voters are to the DNC, your poor whites in Kansas, etc. Like, the flyover people waiting for the pearly white gates. That's the sort of equivalent for
For the GOP.
the Republicans, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it is important that we, uh, I'm not saying don't resist spirituality and faith or anything like that. There are very prominent Christian well like Cornel West. He's a excellent
Hmm.
uh, motivator and speaker and very important person to the leftist movement, I think, but he's still a Christian, and so there's and that's not to say that like we should just welcome people of faith all the time, but there is an insidious nature to the faith, and um, being able to identify what is useful to fight against, and what is acceptable, I guess. Yeah, I'm not sure where I was going
Yeah.
with that thought necessarily, but not. What I'm trying to
I
say
mean, I
is,
think
I'm not saying just accept everybody's faith, or
sure.
reject it wholly, but like understand what the
I think
differences
if
of.
anything,
Go ahead.
but they also kind of provide a pretty instructive example of like organizing and building
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
solidarity.
Well,
And I
and
think that, being ecumenical is something that the left lacks right now, because it's so
it certainly does, yeah.
purity is demanded of everyone. It's not really coalitional, like solidarity, ecumenical work. It's, here's dogma, and that's it.
Hmm.
Like,
For sure, yeah, yeah.
that's the line. That's what you're gonna go out and say, etc.
Yeah, no, and it's been kind of troubling to me to see a lot of the rhetoric that's flying around right now with like, yeah, we should have standards of what people believe, and what people do in the pursuit of like a um better material condition for everybody. But not to go too far away from the subject, but you've got a lot of leftists that are like screaming at junior Congress people for not immediately getting us some kind of socialist return of electing them, sort of thing. Like, and
Yeah.
you'll see a lot of people like rejecting people like Cornel West because he has his Christian faith, and yeah, there's a dogma going around lately, I think, in leftist circles, and I keep getting myself run out of all these leftist fake Facebook groups because I'm like arguing against it and like trying to tell
Mm.
people that maybe having a little bit more of an open tent is not a bad idea if we want actual change, and um
Right.
Yeah, so I agree with you on that. The ecumenical parts of leftism that are being like ignored a lot of times.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Where
I
are we
think
going now?
yeah, I think we kind of hit a dead end in our talk. Maybe I think this was a good introduction to the conversation. I think there's more we
Yeah.
can obviously talk about, but I think this is a good introduction. We
Yeah. I
can
mean, I think it would be cool to do kind of like I mean, like, if we did something that was kind of like going through like evangelical upbringing,
sure, yeah.
especially as it kind of shapes like political subjectivity, I think would be interesting. Just in
Yeah,
terms of like, approaching being like, I guess like to me, like the difference, I guess, is just the way in which like fellowship is important in that kind
hmm
of upbringing. But that's not really a Catholic thing. It's just kind of like going to church for Catholics is really just kind of a social function. Like,
yeah. I've
whereas
noticed
I
that
think for
about Catholics. I my partner grew up in a Catholic family and went to Catholic school, and uh, I attended Christmas mass with them once, and I was
Mhm.
it's so much of a different experience. Like it's just
Yeah.
kind of like a ritual that Catholics seem to just go through. Like they don't go to church any other time except for just Christmas masses when they go. Whereas like a Protestant, and especially an evangelical Protestant, would see that as like some sort of religious failing that you're not going to church every week, or
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's complete. Yeah, because it's about, that personal connection with God that, is, and Catholicism is very much brokered by the church,
yeah, no,
whereas,
brokered by the church,
and
and
but
and
it's
it's kind
also
of built
like,
into the faith that you go through
yeah,
saints to
yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. But yeah, I mean, if we want to save that kind of like nitty gritty stuff
yeah.
for a
No,
later,
I think this was a good introduction. Like I said when we were talking about this conversation before, I think it would be a good idea for us to have a series of talks about this, and we can get into more specific details later on. I think
yeah,
this was a good introduction to the conversation in general, though. So
cool.
I appreciate your time today,
Yeah,
and I'm looking forward to other talks that we have in the future. I'm gonna post this up. I'm gonna do a little bit of editing, not removing
cool.
any part of the conversation, just formatting it for proper view, I guess. Um,
Mhm.
and then I'll be posting that up, and it'll be linked on the Instagram, and I'll post it on my Facebook as well. So thank you for your time, Jacob. I hope you have a pleasant rest of your day, and I look forward to the future.
Dope. Yeah, ditto.
Hi, Michael Deebs here, with no gun pointed at my head. Please know that all content created for the Benzo Rehab Dungeon is and always will be freely available. However, if you would like to support this creation of content, we here at Camp Benzo would appreciate it, as the production itself is not free of cost. Anything donated will go to covering the various subscription fees maintained for content production or improving and expanding the content produced. If you are able to, please head on over to patreon.com/benzo rehab dungeon. We also have shirts for sale on Teespring, all priced as low as we can get them without turning much or any profit. They are mostly so that you can show your loved ones that a necessary intervention may be on the horizon. Links to the merchandise storefront and our various social media profiles can be found on our link tree, which is the word link tr.ee/benzo rehab dungeon. As always, we love you. Please take your medicine.